In an unusual phenomena, a rare tornado struck multiple villages.
"3,000 years ago, an army marched into the sea, the most powerful military force on Earth at that moment. 600 chosen chariots, the elite royal corps of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever produced. They marched in, and they never came back out. For 3,000 years, the sea kept what it swallowed, until now, because something is sitting on the floor of the Gulf of Aqaba that the water can no longer hide. And what it proves about the most debated event in the entire Bible is something that every skeptic, every scholar, and every believer needs to see. There is a place at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba that does not appear on any tourist map. It has no official archaeological designation. No museum exhibition has been built around it. No university department has claimed it as a research site. And yet, what sits on the seafloor at this location is arguably the most significant physical evidence connected to the biblical narrative that has ever been documented. It sits near a stretch of coastline on the eastern edge of the Sinai Peninsula, a place called Nuweiba, and what is down there has been quietly documented, quietly discussed, and quietly set aside by institutions that are not equipped to handle what it means. Nuweiba is not a dramatic location on first appearance. It is a coastal town, a ferry crossing point between Egypt and Saudi Arabia, practical, functional, unremarkable on the surface. But beneath the surface of the water at Nuweiba lies something that changes the character of this location entirely. A natural underwater land bridge, a raised shelf of seabed, running from the Sinai coast across the Gulf toward the Saudi Arabian shore on the opposite side. This shelf sits dramatically shallower than the water on either side of it, wide enough to accommodate the movement of a very large group of people, long enough to span the distance between the two coastlines, and flanked on both sides by underwater drop-offs so steep that the depth increases from walkable to hundreds of feet within a very short lateral distance. That geographic description should sound familiar to anyone who has read the book of Exodus carefully. Exodus 14, verse 22. "And the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon the dry ground, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left, walls of water on the right hand and on the left." And the bathymetric profile of the Nuweiba shelf provides a physical context for that description that no other proposed crossing site has been able to match. Deep water dropping sharply on both sides of a central corridor. Exactly the geographic conditions that would produce the visual reality described in the Exodus account. But the land bridge itself is not the discovery that is forcing a global conversation. It is what has been found on the surface of that land bridge. And what has been found there was captured in unprecedented detail by high-definition underwater drone technology deployed in the waters of the Gulf of Aqaba in recent surveys. What those drones documented on the seafloor of the Nuweiba shelf is not what anyone surveying a normal stretch of Red Sea coastline would expect to find. Coral formations, but not random coral. Coral growing in shapes, precise, geometric, symmetrical, the unmistakable shape of wheels, four-spoked wheels, distributed across the seafloor corridor in a pattern that marine researchers describe as deeply inconsistent with any natural geological or biological process. Coral grows on hard surfaces. That is normal marine biology. What is not normal is coral growing in the specific geometric pattern of a wheel with four spokes radiating from a central hub. Because coral does not organize itself into wheel shapes, unless there is a wheel underneath it, a hard substrate in the exact shape of a wheel providing the surface on which the coral has grown over centuries and millennia. And if that substrate is a wheel, the question that cannot be avoided is what kind of wheel it is, what it came from, how it got there, and why it is distributed across a corridor of seabed that runs between two ancient coastlines. The answer to those questions begins with the design of the wheels themselves, because The four-spoked wheel is not a generic ancient technology. It is specific, historically specific. The four-spoked chariot wheel was the signature design of the Egyptian Royal Military Corps during a very particular period of Egyptian history, the 18th dynasty. This design replaced the earlier six-spoked wheel that had been standard in Egyptian military equipment for the preceding period, and it was itself replaced by different designs in subsequent dynasties, which means the four-spoked wheel serves as a chronological fingerprint. It belongs to a specific window of time, a window that corresponds with extraordinary precision to the period that the most serious biblical chronologists associate with the Exodus account. Researchers who have examined the photographic and video documentation from the drone surveys of the Nuweiba site have noted that the wheel formations are not clustered. They are distributed, spread across the full width of the seafloor corridor, in a pattern that marine forensic analysts describe as inconsistent with a shipwreck or a gradual sinking event. Objects lost from a vessel concentrate in the footprint of that vessel. They do not spread across a wide corridor, but objects caught by an enormous volume of rapidly moving water distribute differently. They spread, they scatter, and they are carried laterally by the force of the water before settling on the bottom as the energy dissipates. And the distribution pattern of the formations at Nuweiba matches that second description with a precision that has produced significant discussion among the researchers who have studied the documentation most carefully. But the drone surveys of recent years added something to the existing photographic record that earlier documentation could not provide: resolution. The difference between early underwater photography at this site and modern high-definition drone imaging is the difference between a blurry suggestion and a clear confirmation. Modern imaging leaves no room for the ambiguity that allowed earlier documentation to be set aside as inconclusive. The geometric precision of the formations is visible. The distribution pattern across the corridor is mappable, and the scale of the overall field of formations is measurable in a way that was not previously possible. What that measurement reveals about the size of the event that deposited these formations is something that researchers are still processing. Because the field is larger than earlier estimates suggested, significantly larger. And then the seismic events of recent years added another dimension to the picture that nobody anticipated. The Gulf of Aqaba sits within one of the most geologically active regions on Earth. The northern reaches of the East African Rift System extend through this area, producing regular seismic activity along fault lines that run beneath the Gulf floor. In 2025 and into 2026, this seismic activity elevated in frequency, producing a series of events that shifted portions of the seabed in ways that altered both the topography of the Nuweiba shelf and the sediment coverage over previously buried material. And what those seismic shifts exposed from beneath the accumulated sediment of centuries added an entirely new category of evidence to what was already documented on the seafloor surface. Beneath the sediment layer in areas adjacent to the coral formations, researchers conducting surveys in the aftermath of the seismic events identified material that preliminary analysis is describing as skeletal remains and Iron Age weaponry. Not modern debris, not recent marine waste, ancient material in a state of preservation that should not be possible in a standard marine environment. But the Gulf of Aqaba is not a standard marine environment. Its mineral composition is specific. Its salt crystal concentration is unusual. And those unusual characteristics create preservation conditions that geologists studying the region describe as capable of protecting metallic and organic material from normal degradation processes for periods of time, far exceeding what would be possible elsewhere. The combination of these elements creates an evidentiary picture that is very difficult to dismiss, with the kind of casual skepticism that has historically been applied to claims about physical evidence of the Exodus, because casual skepticism requires the absence of specific evidence. And specific evidence is precisely what the Nuweiba site is now producing. In high definition, documented by technology that did not exist when previous generations debated these questions. Psalm 77, verses 16 through 19. The waters saw thee, O God. The waters saw thee. They were afraid, the depths also were troubled. The clouds poured out water. The skies sent out a sound. Thy arrows also went abroad. The voice of thy thunder was in the heaven. The lightnings lightened the world. The earth trembled and shook. Thy way is in the sea, and thy path in the great waters, and thy footsteps are not known. Thy path in the great waters, thy footsteps are not known. The path was made, the crossing happened, but the footsteps of God leave no visible trace. What they do leave is the wreckage of what opposed the crossing. 3,000 years of wreckage, preserved in coral, protected by salt crystals, waiting in the dark at the bottom of a gulf that holds its secrets longer than almost anywhere else on Earth, until the technology arrived to see them, and the generation arrived that needed to understand what seeing them means. The physics of the impossible. For most of modern history, the parting of the Red Sea has occupied an uncomfortable position in public discourse, too specific to dismiss as pure myth, too dramatic to accept without physical explanation, and too geographically grounded to treat as purely spiritual allegory. So it has sat in a kind of intellectual no man's land, acknowledged by believers, dismissed by academics, and largely avoided by anyone who did not want to pick a side in a debate that felt unwinnable. But that position is becoming harder to maintain because the science has moved. And where the science has moved is directly toward the text. The key physical description of the crossing mechanism in Exodus is not vague. It is specific enough to model. Exodus 14, verse 21. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. A strong east wind, all that night. Duration, direction, effect. These are not the elements of poetic embellishment. They are the parameters of a physical event. Wind speed, wind direction, time of sustained application, effect on a body of shallow water. All of these can be modeled using the same atmospheric and oceanographic tools that meteorologists and marine scientists use every day. Suhi. In 2010, a study published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal did exactly that. Researchers used advanced computational modeling to simulate the effect of a sustained wind event on the specific geography of a proposed crossing location in the northern Red Sea region. The results were not what the academic establishment expected. The model showed that a sustained wind of sufficient velocity applied from the east across a shallow coastal shelf could displace water dramatically enough to expose a crossable land surface, not permanently, for a window of hours, enough time for a large group of people moving on foot to complete a crossing. And when the wind ceased, the model showed the water returning with significant force, rapidly, powerfully, but in a way consistent with the catastrophic hydraulic event that the debris pattern at Nuweiba suggests. But the 2010 model had limitations. It was working with the geographic data available at that time, and the crossing location it modeled was not Nuweiba. What would the same modeling produce when applied to the specific geography of the Nuweiba shelf? That question has been explored by researchers working with more recent bathymetric data from the Gulf of Aqaba, and the answers they are arriving at are more precise than the 2010 study could achieve. Because the Nuweiba shelf has characteristics that make it an even stronger candidate for the wind displacement model than the northern sites considered in earlier research. The shelf at Nuweiba is shallower than alternative proposed crossing sites, so shallower water requires less wind energy to displace. The shelf is also more geometrically regular than other sites. A more uniform cross-section means the wind displacement effect would be more consistent across the full width of the crossing corridor. And the lateral drop-offs on either side of the shelf are more dramatic at Nuweiba than at any other proposed crossing location in the region, which means the displaced water would have had a very specific place to go, not spreading gradually across a broad, shallow basin. pushed to the sides, held against the steep underwater walls of the drop-offs, creating exactly the visual reality described in Exodus 14, walls of water, on the right hand and on the left. Now, here is where the recent seismic activity adds a dimension to the physical picture that the existing models have not yet fully incorporated. The seismic events of 2025 and 2026 along the fault systems running beneath the Gulf of Aqaba did not just expose buried material on the seafloor. They altered the topography of the shelf itself, raising certain sections, shifting the gradient of the underwater land bridge, and in doing so, they revealed something about the original pre-submersion geography of the shelf that was not previously measurable. Because the seismic shifts exposed sections of the shelf edge that had been covered by sediment accumulation for an extended period. And the profile of those newly exposed sections shows that the original shelf topography was even more favorable for the wind displacement mechanism than the current seafloor configuration suggests. In other words, 3,000 years of sediment accumulation had actually obscured how dramatic the original geography was. The shelf that was exposed during the crossing event was more pronounced, more defined, more precisely configured to produce the effect described in Exodus than what modern surveys showed before the seismic events of recent years began stripping back the accumulated sediment. The land bridge that the ancient Israelites crossed was more clearly defined than even the researchers who were already arguing for the Nuweiba site had realized. And the walls of water that the displaced sea would have formed against the drop-offs on either side were higher and more dramatically vertical than previous models had calculated. But the physical mechanics of the crossing are only part of what the seismic events of 2025 and 2026 have added to this picture. Because what those events exposed from beneath the sediment layer goes beyond the topography of the shelf. The skeletal remains and Iron Age weaponry identified in post-seismic surveys of the northern sections of the Nuweiba site represent a category of evidence that was simply not accessible before the seabed shifted. Not because it was not there, because it was buried, protected beneath decades and centuries of sediment accumulation that prevented both its detection and its deterioration. And now that the seismic events have moved that sediment covering, what it was protecting is becoming visible to researchers who were not expecting to find it. The preservation state of the material identified in the post-seismic surveys is being described by the researchers who have accessed the documentation as remarkable. Not remarkable in the sense of being intact or complete. Ancient biological material does not survive 3,000 years in marine conditions in intact form, regardless of preservation conditions, but remarkable in the sense of being identifiable, of retaining enough structural integrity and associated material culture to allow preliminary analysis to reach conclusions about age and origin. The salt crystal formations that characterize this specific section of the Gulf floor are the primary mechanism responsible for that preservation state. And the geologists studying these formations have identified something about their distribution that adds another layer of significance to the overall picture. The salt crystal concentrations are highest in the areas immediately adjacent to the coral wheel formations, not uniformly distributed across the seafloor, concentrated in specific zones. The same zones where the debris distribution pattern is most consistent with the catastrophic hydraulic event model, which suggests that the preservation mechanism and the depositional event are connected, that the same conditions that created the debris pattern also created the conditions for its preservation, and the water that deposited the material also created the mineral environment that protected it. Exodus 14, verse 28. And the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen and all the host of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. There remained not so much as one of them. Not so much as one of them. The totality of that statement has always struck careful readers of the text. Not most of them, not the majority, not the vast majority, not one. A complete and total event. No survivors, no recovery operations, no retrieval of bodies or equipment. Everything that entered the corridor when the water returned stayed in the corridor, and the debris field at Nuweiba is consistent with exactly that kind of total depositional event. The distribution suggests everything was caught simultaneously, not progressively, not in waves, all at once. When the water came back, it came back for everything, and it held everything it caught in the same mineral environment that has been protecting what it caught for the 3,000 years since. Now, there is one aspect of the physical mechanics of this event that rarely gets discussed in mainstream coverage of the Nuweiba evidence, and it connects the geochemistry of the Gulf of Aqaba directly to one of the most specific details in the Exodus account. The account describes the sea returning not as a gentle tide, but as a sudden catastrophic event. Exodus 14, verse 27. And Moses stretched forth his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to his strength when the morning appeared. To his strength, the sea returning to its full force, not gradually, not incrementally, due to its strength. Oceanographic modeling of what happens when a sustained wind displacement event ends suddenly produces a specific physical phenomenon. When the wind that has been holding water away from its natural resting position stops, the displaced water does not return gradually. It returns in a surge. The energy that was being continuously supplied by the wind to hold the water in its displaced position is suddenly withdrawn, and the water, which has been under continuous hydrostatic pressure to return to equilibrium, releases that stored pressure all at once, in a surge, a wall of water moving rapidly back across the surface that was exposed, carrying with it everything on that surface at the moment of return. But with a force that hydrodynamic modeling describes as capable of covering the distance of the Nuweiba shelf in minutes, not hours, minutes. That physical reality is what the debris pattern on the Nuweiba seafloor reflects. A sudden, total depositional event. Everything caught simultaneously. Everything deposited across the full width of the corridor as the surge moved from both sides toward the center. And everything held in place by the same mineral conditions that the Gulf of Aqaba's specific water chemistry immediately began creating around the deposited material, preserving it for 3,000 years, until the seismic events of our own era began moving the sediment that had accumulated on top of it. And the drone technology of our own era began documenting what the sediment had been covering. The ancient Egypt was the most documented civilization of the ancient world. Not by accident, by design. The pharaohs of Egypt understood something that modern politicians understand equally well: control the narrative, and you control the legacy. So they built monuments, carved inscriptions into stone that would outlast empires, commissioned detailed records of military campaigns, religious ceremonies, agricultural yields, and administrative decisions. They documented everything that served the narrative they wanted to leave behind. And they erased everything that did not. The ancient Egyptians practiced what modern historians call damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, the deliberate removal of a person, an event, or an outcome from the official historical record. It happened to Hatshepsut, on the female pharaoh whose successor had her image chiseled from temple walls and her name removed from official king lists. It happened to Akhenaten, whose religious revolution was so thoroughly erased by subsequent administrations that his existence was unknown to modern scholars until the 19th century. And it happened, with less fanfare but equal thoroughness, to the record of whatever occurred during the period that biblical chronologists most seriously associate with the Exodus. The 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt is one of the most extensively documented periods in all of ancient history. Its pharaohs left enormous archaeological footprints: temples at Karnak and Luxor, the Valley of the Kings, military records carved into stone at multiple sites across Egypt and into the territories of ancient Canaan and Nubia. The 18th dynasty documented its military campaigns obsessively, victory after victory recorded in exhausting detail, the names of defeated kings, the quantities of tribute extracted, the numbers of prisoners taken, the territories annexed, every triumph immortalized in stone, which makes one specific absence in the 18th dynasty record all the more striking. Among the military records of this period, researchers have identified a gap, not a gap in the sense of missing documents, a gap in the sense of an outcome that is never recorded, an elite military division that appears in records up to a certain point, and then simply does not appear again. No reassignment documented, no reorganization recorded, no battle account explaining what happened to them. They are present in the records, and then they are absent, and with no explanation offered anywhere in the surviving Egyptian documentation. Now, the absence of a record is not the same as evidence of an event. Historians rightly caution against building arguments primarily on what is missing rather than what is present. Documents are lost. Records are destroyed. Administrative priorities shift. The absence of documentation has many potential explanations, but in this case, the absence has specific characteristics that elevate it beyond a simple gap in the historical record, because it coincides with something else, a change in the administrative and military structure of Egypt that follows the period of the absence, a restructuring that makes sense only in the context of a catastrophic loss of the existing structure, and a pattern of monument alteration and inscription management in the period immediately following the absence that bears the hallmarks of deliberate historical suppression rather than ordinary administrative change. Egyptologists studying this period have noted that the transition between certain reigns in the 18th dynasty shows evidence of unusual narrative management, the kind of management that appears in the historical record when a subsequent administration is attempting to control how its predecessor is remembered. Monuments altered, cartouches modified, the official presentation of a reign carefully curated to emphasize certain aspects and omit others, and the aspect most consistently omitted from the official record of this period is any account of a catastrophic military loss. Not unusual for ancient Egypt, which routinely omitted military defeats from its official record, but unusual in scale, because what appears to be omitted here is not a single battle. It is an entire military engagement, an entire elite division, gone from the record without explanation. The forensic evidence from the Nuweiba seafloor connects to this historical gap through a specific material detail, the metallurgical analysis of material scraped from the coral-encrusted formations on the Nuweiba shelf, specifically the axial components of the wheel formations. The analysis has identified trace concentrations of gold and electrum in the material composition of these components. Electrum is a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver. It was used extensively in ancient Egypt for decorative and ceremonial applications, but its presence on military equipment is not random. In the 18th dynasty of Egypt, the royal chariot corps used equipment finished with gold and electrum overlays, not as decoration in the modern sense, as markers of divine authority and royal status. The chariot of the Pharaoh and the equipment of his personal royal guard carried these metallic overlays as visible symbols of their connection to the divine. Standard military chariots did not carry this ornamentation. Only the elite, only the corps that accompanied the pharaoh himself, the most prestigious, the most expensive, the most symbolically significant military unit in the ancient world. The presence of gold and electrum traces on components recovered from the Nuweiba seafloor does not just suggest Egyptian military origin. It suggests royal Egyptian military origin. The personal corps of the pharaoh, not a standard unit sent in pursuit of escaped slaves. The elite division, the one that would have accompanied a pharaoh who was personally invested in the pursuit, personally humiliated by the loss of his labor force, personally determined to make an example of those who had defied his authority. Exodus 14, verse 17. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they shall follow them. And I will get me honor upon Pharaoh, and upon all his host, upon his chariots, and upon his horsemen, upon Pharaoh, upon all his host, upon his chariots, upon his horsemen. The language of Exodus describes the pursuing force in terms that suggest the personal involvement of the pharaoh at the highest level of military commitment, not a detachment sent to retrieve escaped workers. A royal military response, the kind of response that would involve the elite Royal Chariot Corps, the corps whose equipment carried gold and electrum overlays, the same overlays whose traces are appearing in metallurgical analysis of the Nuweiba coral formations. But the forensic picture does not stop at metallurgy, because the debris distribution pattern at Nuweiba tells a story about the military formation that was caught by the returning water. And that story is consistent with what we know about how the Royal Chariot Corps of the 18th dynasty deployed in the field. The Royal Chariot Corps did not travel in a single column. They spread. They deployed across a wide front, a formation designed for maximum visual impact and tactical flexibility, which means that when the water returned and caught them in the corridor, they were distributed across the full width of the crossing area, not clustered, not concentrated, spread across the same width that the debris field at Nuweiba covers. That correlation between known 18th dynasty military deployment practice and the debris distribution pattern at Nuweiba is not widely discussed in mainstream coverage of this evidence, but for researchers who understand both ancient Egyptian military history and marine debris forensics, it is one of the most significant convergences in the entire body of evidence, because it is not just saying the right things are in the right place, it is saying the right things are in the right place in the right pattern, the pattern that the specific military unit described in Exodus would have produced when caught by a catastrophic hydraulic event while deployed in standard formation. Now, here is a dimension of the historical record that almost never appears in discussions of this evidence. Ancient Egyptian texts from the period following the reign in question contain references that, read against the backdrop of the Exodus account, carry a weight that their original scholarly interpreters did not assign to them. References to a period of national mourning, to the absence of military leaders who should have returned, to a loss so significant that it produced structural changes in the organization of the Egyptian military for years afterward. These references have been studied primarily in the context of internal political transitions between dynasties, interpreted as the ordinary mourning associated with the death of a pharaoh and the transition to a new reign. But the scale of the mourning described in these texts exceeds what would normally accompany a royal succession. It describes something broader, something that affected more than the royal household, something that left a gap in Egyptian society that was felt at the institutional level for an extended period. Exodus 12, verse 30. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. A great cry in Egypt, not a house where there was not one dead. So the scale of loss described in Exodus is national, total, penetrating every level of Egyptian society, and the Egyptian texts from this period, carefully read, describe exactly that kind of national grief. Not a victory celebration, not a triumphant military return, an absence, a silence, a gap in the record where the returning army should have been. The silence of the Egyptian record is itself a form of testimony, because the Egyptians documented their military victories with extraordinary thoroughness. The absence of any account of what happened during the Exodus pursuit is not neutral. In a civilization that recorded everything that served its narrative, the absence of an account is its own kind of account. It says that what happened did not serve the narrative. Know that it was something the subsequent administration chose to manage rather than record, something too catastrophic, too humiliating, too theologically destabilizing for an empire built on the divine status of its ruler. To have that ruler's elite personal military corps swallowed by a sea while pursuing escaped slaves would have been precisely the kind of event that the Egyptian record-keeping system was designed to erase, and it was erased thoroughly, consistently, successfully, for 3,000 years, until the sea began giving back what it swallowed, until coral formations on the floor of the Gulf of Aqaba began to make the shape of the erased record visible again, until seismic events shifted the sediment covering what the sea had been protecting, and until drone technology produced documentation detailed enough that the erased record can be read again, not from stone, from the seafloor, where the evidence has been sitting since the morning the water came back, patient, preserved, waiting for exactly the generation that is finding it now. There is a category of biblical prophecy that most people overlook completely. Not the prophecies about kingdoms rising and falling, not the visions of beasts and trumpets and bowls of judgment, but a quieter category, prophecies about physical evidence, about specific objects in specific locations that would serve a specific purpose for a specific future generation, prophecies that describe not just events, but artifacts, not just history, but the physical residue of history, preserved deliberately, placed intentionally, awaiting for the moment when a generation would need to see them. The ancient Hebrew writers understood the Red Sea crossing as more than a rescue operation. They understood it as a demonstration, a display of divine power so overwhelming that its physical evidence would outlast the generation that witnessed it, would survive every empire that rose and fell in the centuries after it, would be protected through 3,000 years of geological change, marine biology, and sediment accumulation, for a purpose, a future purpose, attached to a future generation, living in a future moment that the ancient writers described with specific enough detail that it is recognizable from inside it. Psalm 66, verses 5 and 6. Come and see the works of God. He is terrible in his doing toward the children of men. And he turned the sea into dry land. They went through the flood on foot. There did we rejoice in him. Come and see the works of God. This is an active invitation. Not come and remember, not come and imagine, not come and read about, come and see. Present tense, active, visual. An invitation to observe something that can be seen with eyes. And the works being invited for observation are specifically the works associated with the turning of the sea into dry land. That invitation was written 3,000 years ago, and for 3,000 years it could only be received as an invitation to remember, to read the account, to visualize what the ancient text described. But in 2024, and 2025 and 2026, that invitation can be received differently, because what the ancient text describes can now be seen, not imagined, not reconstructed from written accounts, seen in high-definition drone footage from the floor of the Gulf of Aqaba. Come and see the works of God. The invitation has found its generation, but the prophetic connection between the Exodus evidence and the end times is not limited to general invitations to observe divine power. It is embedded in specific texts that connect the physical remains of the Exodus to a specific future moment in the prophetic timeline. And those texts are more precise than most people realize. The prophet Micah wrote something that most readers of his book treat as historical commentary on the condition of Israel in his own time. But embedded within his writing is a forward-looking reference that connects the demonstration of divine power at the Exodus to a future act of divine power at the end of the age. Micah 7, verse 15. According to the days of thy coming out of the land of Egypt will I show unto him marvelous things. According to the days of thy coming out of Egypt will I show marvelous things, future tense, not describing what God did at the Exodus, describing what God will do in connection with the pattern of the Exodus in a future moment. Marvelous things shown, things that produce wonder, things visible enough to be shown rather than simply told. The word translated marvelous here in the Hebrew is pele. It carries the meaning of something extraordinary, something that exceeds normal expectation, something that produces the response of wonder, precisely because it falls outside the boundaries of what was previously considered possible. And the chariot wheels sitting on the floor of the Red Sea fall exactly within that category for the generation encountering them. 3,000 years of preservation in a marine environment, a debris field distributed across a seafloor corridor, in a pattern that matches a catastrophic hydraulic event, metallurgical traces of Royal Egyptian military equipment, a seismic exposure of previously buried skeletal remains, and Iron Age weaponry, all of it at a location that corresponds geographically with the most detailed biblical account of the crossing. That is Pele. That is the marvelous things that Micah said would be shown, in connection with the pattern of the Exodus, at the appointed future moment. Now, here is the dimension of this prophetic connection that is almost never discussed in mainstream coverage of the Nuweiba evidence. The ancient Hebrew texts do not just describe the physical evidence of the Exodus being preserved. They describe its preservation as intentional, purposeful. The evidence was not accidentally surviving through a fortunate combination of geological conditions. It was being kept, held in place by the same power that created it, for the generation that would need to see it. Isaiah 46, verses 9 and 10. Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is none else. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done. Declaring the end from the beginning. The same God who orchestrated the Exodus built its physical evidence into the geography of the Red Sea, not as a byproduct of the event, as a declaration, a statement made at the beginning that was always intended to be read at the end, a message placed in the seafloor of the Gulf of Aqaba 3,000 years ago for a generation, 3,000 years in the future. But the physical coordinates of the Nuweiba discovery carry an additional layer of prophetic significance that connects the crossing site to the broader geography of the ancient Exodus narrative. Because Nuweiba is not just a crossing point, it is a waypoint, a location along a route, and the route it sits on leads somewhere specific, somewhere that the ancient texts identify as the most significant geographic destination in the entire Exodus narrative. Chad, Mount Sinai. Biblical scholars who take the Nuweiba crossing site seriously as a geographic location have noted that the trajectory of the crossing from the Sinai coast across the Gulf of Aqaba to the Saudi Arabian shore places the ancient Israelite migration route on a path that points directly toward the northwestern region of Saudi Arabia, toward a mountain in that region that has attracted significant and growing archaeological attention. Jabal al-Lawz, a mountain in the Tabuk region of modern Saudi Arabia that researchers studying the physical geography of the Exodus route have identified as the most geographically plausible candidate for the biblical Mount Sinai. The physical features of Jabal al-Lawz include characteristics that match specific details in the Exodus account with a precision that has made serious researchers look very carefully at this location. Blackened rock at the summit, consistent with the description of fire descending on the mountain. A large plain at the base, consistent with the encampment of a very large group of people. Ancient boundary markers around the mountain, consistent with the prohibition against approaching it, recorded in Exodus. A split rock formation nearby, consistent with the account of water flowing from a rock in the wilderness. Each of these details individually could be explained in other ways, but together, they form a geographic argument for a specific Exodus route that the Nuweiba crossing site anchors at its most critical point, the crossing of the sea. And if the crossing happened at Nuweiba, the route that follows the crossing leads directly to Jabal al-Lawz, which means the chariot wheels on the Nuweiba seafloor are not just evidence of the crossing. They are the beginning of a trail of physical evidence that runs from the Gulf of Aqaba into the interior of the Arabian Peninsula, a trail that researchers are still following, and still finding things along. There is a conversation that is not happening in the places where it should be happening most loudly. Not in university archaeology departments, not in the pages of peer-reviewed journals that cover ancient Near Eastern history, not in the mainstream media outlets that routinely cover significant archaeological discoveries. And not in the official statements of the governmental bodies that have jurisdictional authority over the waters where the evidence sits. The conversation about what is on the floor of the Gulf of Aqaba at Nuweiba is happening. But it is happening in the wrong places according to the institutions that believe they should be controlling it. It is happening on screens, in homes, among ordinary people who have access to the documentation and the intelligence to understand what they are looking at, without institutional permission, without editorial management, without the filtering process that has historically determined which archaeological discoveries receive serious public attention and which ones are quietly redirected away from conclusions that create institutional discomfort. See, that filtering process is not a conspiracy theory. It is an observable feature of how academic archaeology has functioned for most of its modern history. The discipline has gatekeepers, journals with editorial boards, universities with tenure committees, funding bodies with ideological preferences, government archaeological authorities with jurisdictional interests. And those gatekeepers have historically exercised significant control over which discoveries receive the institutional validation that translates into mainstream public awareness. Discoveries that fit within the existing scholarly consensus move smoothly through the system. Discoveries that challenge the existing scholarly consensus encounter friction. Not always deliberately, not always consciously, but systematically. The existing scholarly consensus on the Exodus is well established. It holds that the Exodus as described in the biblical account did not occur as a literal historical event, that the numbers are exaggerated, the geography is confused, the archaeological evidence from Egypt and Canaan does not support a mass migration of the scale described, that the Exodus is better understood as a foundational narrative, a theological statement about the relationship between God and Israel, a story that carries truth without necessarily carrying historical factuality in every detail. This consensus has been built over more than a century of serious academic work. It is held by genuinely intelligent and genuinely sincere scholars, and it creates a significant institutional problem for the evidence at Nuweiba. Because the evidence at Nuweiba does not gently suggest that the consensus might need adjustment. It directly contradicts the foundational assumption on which the consensus rests, the assumption that there is no physical evidence for the Exodus. If there are chariot wheels on the floor of the Red Sea at the location described in the biblical account, in a wheel design specific to the dynasty that the biblical timeline points toward, distributed in a pattern consistent with the catastrophic hydraulic event described in Exodus, then the foundational assumption of the consensus is wrong. Not partially wrong, not wrong in its details, wrong at the foundation. And institutions do not handle foundational challenges well. They handle them by redirecting, by reframing, by applying the label of pseudo-archaeology to the evidence and the researchers presenting it before the evidence has been given the kind of rigorous examination that would normally precede that label. This is exactly what has happened with the Nuweiba evidence across its documented history. Reports of unusual formations in the Gulf of Aqaba have been in circulation among researchers for decades. Photographs were taken, accounts were written, discussions were had, and the institutional response was consistent. Not engagement, not rigorous refutation with counter-evidence, dismissal, categorization, the application of the pseudo-archaeology label without the kind of serious methodological engagement that the label is supposed to follow rather than precede. But the dismissal strategy that worked in previous decades is facing a new challenge in 2025 and 2026, because the documentation now available is of a quality that the dismissal strategy was not designed to handle. High-definition underwater drone imaging does not leave the same room for ambiguity that earlier photography did. The geometric precision of the formations is not a matter of interpretation when the resolution of the imaging is sufficient to resolve individual structural details. The distribution pattern across the corridor is not a matter of opinion when it can be mapped with the precision that modern bathymetric survey technology provides. And the seismic exposure of previously buried material has added a category of evidence that was simply not part of the picture when the dismissal strategy was first deployed. The institutional response to this new quality of documentation has been notable for what it is not. It is not rigorous engagement with the specific evidential claims. It is not the kind of methodological critique that would carry weight if the evidence were being taken seriously. It is silence, the specific, deliberate, strategic silence of institutions that have calculated that engagement creates more problems than it solves, because engagement requires acknowledging the evidence. Acknowledging the evidence requires explaining why it does not mean what it appears to mean, and explaining why four-spoked chariot wheels in 18th Dynasty design are distributed across an underwater land bridge at Nuweiba in a debris pattern consistent with a catastrophic hydraulic event without connecting that explanation to the Exodus account is a task that the existing scholarly consensus is not well equipped to perform, so it performs silence instead. But silence has a limited effectiveness in an era of global information distribution. The same technological revolution that produced the drone imaging at Nuweiba also produced the distribution infrastructure that allows that imaging to reach hundreds of millions of people without passing through any institutional filter. A video documenting what sits on the floor of the Gulf of Aqaba can be seen by more people in 48 hours than have visited the physical site in the entire modern era. The gatekeeping function that academic institutions and mainstream media outlets have historically performed is becoming less effective with every year that passes. And the Nuweiba evidence is one of the clearest examples of what that shift means in practice. Every sign in the biblical framework exists for one primary purpose: not to satisfy curiosity, not to provide intellectual entertainment for people interested in the intersection of archaeology and theology, not to give prophecy enthusiasts new material for timelines and charts. Signs exist to warn, and warnings exist to produce response. A warning that produces no response has failed its purpose entirely, regardless of how accurate it was, regardless of how clearly it was communicated, regardless of how much physical evidence accompanied it. The generation that witnessed the plagues of Egypt had access to the most concentrated sequence of divine signs in the entire biblical record: water turning to blood, darkness covering the land, the death of the firstborn moving through every household, sign after sign, warning after warning, delivered with unmistakable clarity to the most powerful ruler on earth. And Pharaoh hardened his heart again and again and again, not because the signs were unclear, because the response that the signs demanded was one he was not willing to make. That pattern is the most sobering element of the entire Exodus narrative, and not the plagues themselves, not the parting of the sea, not even the drowning of the army, the hardening of the heart in the presence of overwhelming evidence, the human capacity to see clearly and still refuse to respond. And it is the pattern that the ancient texts connect most directly to the final period of history, not as a description of what Pharaoh did 3,000 years ago, as a warning about what the generation living in the final period will be tempted to do when the evidence surfaces, when the signs converge, when the physical confirmation of the ancient texts becomes impossible to dismiss. Romans 1, verses 20 and 21. 2. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him, not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Clearly seen, without excuse, known but not glorified. This is not a description of ignorance. It is a description of informed refusal, the knowledge present, the evidence clear, the response withheld, and the consequence of that withheld response described as a darkening, a progressive loss of the capacity to see clearly. The chariot wheels on the floor of the Red Sea are not the first sign delivered to this generation. They are part of a sequence, a building accumulation of physical and prophetic evidence that has been developing across decades: the rebirth of the nation of Israel in 1948, the reunification of Jerusalem in 1967, the return of Jewish communities to the land from every nation on earth, the normalization agreements reshaping the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East, the drying of the Euphrates River documented by satellite, the emergence of ancient structures from the receding Sea of Galilee, and now the surfacing of Exodus evidence from the floor of the Red Sea. Each of these developments carries weight in the prophetic framework. Each of them individually would be significant. Together, they form a pattern of convergence that the ancient texts associate specifically with the season preceding the most dramatic divine intervention in human history since the Exodus itself. Luke 21, verses 28 and 29. And when these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. And he spake to them a parable. Behold the fig tree and all the trees. When they now shoot forth, ye see and know of your own selves that summer is now nigh at hand. When these things begin to come to pass, not when they are complete, not when the final event has occurred, when they begin, when the pattern starts becoming recognizable, that is when the instruction changes. Look up, lift up your heads, not look down in fear, not look away in denial. Look up. You're with the posture of people who understand that what is approaching is not primarily threatening. It is redemptive. But the warning embedded in the Exodus evidence is not only about what is coming, it is about what is required right now, in the present moment, before the final sequence of events reaches its conclusion. Because the generation that finds the evidence is not passive in the story, it has a role, a response that the ancient texts describe as both possible and necessary. And the failure to make that response is itself described as one of the defining characteristics of the generation living in the final period. The warning of the Exodus evidence is therefore not primarily about the sequence of events to come, for it is about the condition of the heart that determines how a person stands when those events arrive, because the events are coming regardless. The sequence is in motion regardless. The appointed moment is approaching regardless of whether any individual acknowledges it or responds to it. What is not predetermined is the condition of each individual heart when that moment arrives, whether it is soft enough to receive what the evidence is offering, or hardened enough to process the evidence as information without allowing it to produce transformation. Joel 2, verses 12 and 13. Therefore also now saith the Lord, turn ye even to me with all your heart, and with fasting, and with weeping, and with mourning, and rend your heart, and not your garments, and turn unto the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and of great kindness, and repenteth him of the evil. Turn ye even to me, even now, in the middle of the evidence, in the middle of the signs, in the middle of the convergence that the prophetic framework describes as the threshold of the most significant divine intervention since the Red Sea. Even now, the door is not closed, the invitation is still active, and the character of the God being revealed in the evidence is the same character described in this verse: gracious, merciful, slow to anger, of great kindness. The same God who preserved chariot wheels on the floor of the sea for 3,000 years is the same God described as repenting of judgment when the people he is calling turn back toward him. So that is the warning the Exodus evidence is carrying, not a threat, an invitation, from the same God who made a path through the sea for people who did not deserve it, who crossed them to safety on the dry ground of an impossible corridor, who held the walls of water on both sides until every one of his people had reached the other shore, and who then released the water, not in anger, in justice, the same justice that had been patient across 400 years of Egyptian slavery, the same justice that had sent sign after sign before the final consequences arrived, the same justice that is sending signs again to a generation with more access to the evidence than any that has come before it. The evidence has been laid out. The forensic case has been made. The prophetic framework has been connected to the physical reality. The historical documentation has been examined. the institutional silence has been noted. The warning has been delivered. And now, the only question that matters is the one that every person watching this video must answer for themselves. What do you do with it? Not, what do you think about it? Not, how do you categorize it theologically? Not, which prophetic school of interpretation does it best fit within? What do you do with it? Because the ancient texts that describe this evidence surfacing in the final period did not describe the appropriate response as intellectual engagement. They described it as something more costly, more personal, more demanding than updating a worldview or revising a theological position. Suki. The Exodus narrative itself contains the clearest description of the appropriate response to evidence of divine power. It is not found in the moment of the crossing. It is found in the moment before the crossing, when the sea was still in front of them, when the Egyptian army was behind them, when there was no human solution available in any direction, and a terrified group of former slaves had to make a decision about whether to trust the God who had brought them to this impossible place. Exodus 14, verse 13. And Moses said unto the people, Fear ye not, stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show to you today. For the Egyptians whom ye have seen today, ye shall see them again, no more forever. Fear ye not, stand still, see the salvation of the Lord. 3 instructions, not complex, not requiring theological sophistication, not limited to the educated or the experienced or the long-established believer. 3 instructions available to every person, regardless of where they are starting from. Fear ye not. The evidence of God's power in the past is the foundation for trust in God's power in the present. The chariot wheels on the seafloor are not there to frighten the generation that finds them. They are there to remind that generation of what God is capable of what he has already done, of the scale of intervention he is willing to make on behalf of people who have run out of human options. Fear ye not. Stand still. In a culture of constant motion, constant distraction, constant noise competing for attention, stand still is one of the most countercultural instructions in the entire Bible. And it means stop running from the implications of what the evidence is saying. Stop filling the space where honest reckoning should be with activity and distraction and the management of comfortable distance from uncomfortable truth. Stand still and let the weight of what is being revealed actually land. See the salvation of the Lord, not figure out the salvation of the Lord, not calculate the salvation of the Lord, not debate the salvation of the Lord. See it. Trust that it is coming. Trust that the God who made a way through the sea before is capable of making a way through whatever is coming next. Not because the circumstances look manageable. The circumstances before the first crossing did not look manageable either. Sea in front, army behind. No options in any human direction. But because the character of the God who orchestrated the first crossing is the same character of the God who is orchestrating whatever comes next, and that character is established, demonstrated, preserved in coral on the floor of the Red Sea, for the generation that needs to see it. 3,000 years ago, an army marched into the sea. They marched in with confidence, with the full weight of the most powerful empire on earth behind them, with the certainty that what had escaped them would be brought back, that the humiliation of the previous weeks would be reversed, that the God of a slave nation was no match for the accumulated military power of Egypt. They marched in, and the sea swallowed them whole. For 3,000 years the sea kept what it swallowed, while empires rose and fell above it, while languages changed and civilizations collapsed, and the world that produced both the army and the people it was pursuing became ancient history. The sea kept its record, patient, undisturbed, protected by depth and darkness and the unique mineral conditions of the Gulf of Aqaba, waiting, not randomly, not accidentally, waiting for the generation that would need to see it. That generation is here. The drones are in the water. The documentation exists. The forensic analysis is accumulating. The seismic events of our own era are exposing what the sediment of centuries had been covering. And the evidence is speaking, in the language of coral-encrusted wheels, in the language of gold-traced axle components, in the language of a debris field distributed across an underwater corridor in the exact pattern that the event described in Exodus would have produced. Exodus 14, verse 13. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. The generation standing at the edge of the Red Sea 3,000 years ago was told to stand still, to stop running, to stop calculating human options, to stop managing the fear that comes when circumstances exceed human capacity to resolve them, and to see, to look at what God was about to do and trust that what he had already demonstrated he was capable of was sufficient foundation for whatever came next. That instruction has not been retired. It is being reissued to a generation standing at its own impossible edge, with its own sea in front of it, with its own accumulation of forces bearing down from behind, and with evidence on the floor of that sea that the God who made a way before is capable of making a way again. The sea has not finished speaking. It has barely begun.